Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to learn all about access modifiers, specifically private and public, learn what they do and just how important they are. Okay, so access modifiers. Like the name implies, it controls what kind of access we have with something. We've already seen them a little bit. A while ago when we defined these functions inside our class, I told you that you need to make this public. This is the access modifier. In general, you have two access modifiers, you have public and private. Now technically there are more. There's also protected, and there's also internal, and a bunch more. So technically there are more, but most cases you will only be using either private or public. Now here I told you to make this public because if we don't define the access modifier, if we just do this, just like this, then up here we can see our function has an error. It is saying the sayHello function is inaccessible due to its protection level. That is because if we don't specifically say public, if we omit the access modifier, then this one basically defaults to private. So if we write nothing is the same thing as if we explicitly write private. And like the error says, we cannot call the function because we have no access. It is private. When we make something private, it is only accessible to that class and nothing else. So up here we cannot call the sayHello function, but for example over here inside any code inside of the player class, over here we can call sayHello, and yep, this one works perfectly. So by making something private, it means it can only be accessed by that class where it's been defined. And what I'm saying here applies to functions but also to fields. For example, if this one is public, then up here on the main we can access ironman player.name and we can set it to something, so this works, this is valid code. However, again, if we omit this, which again is going to default into private. If so, then yep, now this one is inaccessible. If we do want this field or this function to be accessible from outside, then we do need to mark them as public. So public string, and over here, public void. Now, if you're a beginner, you might be thinking this is just adding needless confusion to the code. You might be thinking, why wouldn't you just make everything public so you can access everything from everywhere? And that is one of those questions that is perfectly reasonable for a beginner to ask. And as you grow your skills, you will actually see just how valuable this is. The next two lectures are going to be on the theory behind how and why to write good clean code, and one of the main clean code principles is simply to limit access. The reason why public and private exists, the reason for this is all about helping you manage complexity, and the best way to manage complexity is to limit accessibility. So access modifiers are really extremely important. Like I said, I'm going to cover this topic in much more detail in the next two lectures. For now, just know these are extremely important, and as a general rule, you should always default to making everything private and only make it public when you have a very good reason to do it. So by default, we should define all of these as private. So this one is private, this one make it private, and the public string make it private. Yep, so by default we should start writing our code like this, and then for each piece of code we write, we should be able to ask ourselves, okay, does this need to be public? And if so, like for example over here, we do intentionally want to create some player objects, so we do want this one to be public. Then for the function, we also want this code up here to be able to call the function, so this one should be public. However, for the name field, this one is meant to be an internal piece of data that is only used by this class, so this one should be marked as private, and out here we should not have access to that field. So as a general rule, just follow that basic guideline, default to making everything private and only make it public if you absolutely need to. If you just follow that one very simple rule, you will write much better, much more high quality code. And like we saw, technically we don't need to write the access modifier. If you want it private, you can just omit it, and this is going to default to private. However, personally, I like being as explicit as possible. So even though technically you don't have to write it, personally I always write it every time. I want to be very, very clear that I want this to be private. I don't want to have to remember what are the defaults, because actually defaults default to different things depending on what code you're working on. There is a great guide on the C# docs that goes into this topic in a lot more detail, so you can see all of the various access modifiers and from where you can call some kind of thing or access some kind of variable. And then down here, if we scroll down, we can see, yep, the default access summary table, and you can see how for some things, if we omit it, it defaults to private, but for other things it defaults to public, and for others defaults to internal. I'm going to cover all of this in detail in future lectures, interface, structs, enums, and so on. Since the default actually defaults to various different things depending on what type we're working with, that is yet another reason why I really believe you should be as extremely explicit as possible. So over here, do not just omit this, let's write it properly, private. And now that I've taught you what are access modifiers, I can finally explicitly define them over here on this code. Honestly, this is something that has been driving me crazy throughout this whole course. I didn't want to use them until I explained them. I really don't like how this default code is set up, but now that you know what they are, now I can finally refactor this code. Over here for the player class, this one is only going to be used inside the program class, so let's make it as private. Again, by defining this one as private means that we can use it inside of anything within this program class code block. Then for main, let's also default this to private. This is our main entry point for our code, so we don't want any other code calling this function. And then for our program class, instead of making it internal, let's make it public. Public because in this case, this one is a global class inside this namespace. And if we try making this as private, then nope, this actually throws an error. Basically, elements defined in a namespace itself, these need to be either internal or public. So let's put it as public. Okay, so now the code is much more explicit, everything is much more clear. We can know for certain that the main is only going to be the entry point and is never going to be called from anywhere else. We can see that this player class is only going to be used inside the program class, and within the player class we can see that the constructor is meant to be accessible from outside, this function also accessible outside, but this name field, this one is meant to be only used by this class. Okay, so with that we have learned about the basic access modifiers, and this pretty much concludes the absolute basics. So now, like I said, in the next two lectures, let's learn a little bit more on the theory behind how to write good clean code, starting with one of the most important guidelines for that, which is naming rules. So let's learn that in the next lecture.